Hi, folks. I can see you joining us here. It's Paul Coulter speaking from the European Leadership Forum. The title of the session, as you'll have seen, is Are We Just Naked Apes? So I hope you can see that on the screen just now. And this question, it's not my title, I have to say that. I'll explain as we go through who came up with this title. So I am kind of stealing someone else's catchy title. So if it drew you in, that's not my doing. But this is a kind of important question for us. The idea is, how can we approach a question like this from an apologetic point of view as people who want to share the gospel of Jesus? And it could be that you'll encounter people who have this objection. They'll say, well, surely science has told us that human beings are just another animal, just another species. We're no different than chimps, really. We're very similar to them. Now, I don't know about your experience of life, but if we're asking the question, what is it about Homo Sapiens, the name that we've given ourselves, a name that means wise man, which I don't know about your part of the world, but in my part of the world, if someone calls you a wise guy, that's not a compliment. But we've called ourselves wise man, the wise species, Homo Sapiens. So what is it about us that is different from other species? And we can approach that in a number of different ways. So in my working life, my adult life, I've done various different jobs. I've worked in different ways. I started out my working life as a doctor. I then moved out of medicine to work as a pastor and to train in theology, pastoral theology as I did that. I then took up a role as well, which has only ever been a small part of my life, but as a lay magistrate here in Northern Ireland where I live. And that is a different kind of interaction with people, obviously, a much more formal setting. And then I became a lecturer in a Bible college. These are all jobs that I've done currently. I'm working with a Christian organization, training and supporting Christian leaders. So that brings together, I suppose, skills that I've gained in those various different settings. But why I'm telling you that is not just as a way of introducing me, although that might be helpful for you. You know where I'm coming from. I'm a medic. I've studied a little bit of genetics while I was a student. I have a degree in medical genetics, but I've also studied a lot about theology and had some experience with law. But every single one of those jobs is something that is distinctively human. I mean, even that in itself, even the fact that I'm talking to you in various countries using technology like this, I think we can be pretty sure that the chimpanzees aren't having a Zoom call somewhere to talk about what makes chimpanzees distinctive or what's so weird about human beings. So in that sense, our everyday experience of life, so much of what we do and how we do it, we know that there's something quite special about us as human beings. But the question with that is, does that tell us anything? I mean, is it just a little bit of a difference, or is it a substantive difference? Is it a difference in degree or in kind? Let me explain that. So a difference in degree is saying that we are a bit more intelligent than other species. A difference in kind would be saying we're a different kind of creature altogether. So which is it? Well, of course, the dominant theory about human origins in the Western world, certainly for quite some time, that comes through in our media repeatedly, is the idea of evolution and the idea that human beings, Homo sapiens, is simply the most highly evolved in this sequence of different Homo something or others that, of course, shares common ancestors with apes. And Charles Darwin, back in 1871, who thought a lot about these questions of human distinctiveness from other species, said this. He said, there can be no doubt that the difference between the mind of the lowest man and that of the highest animal is immense. Nevertheless, the difference in mind between man and the higher animals, great as it is, certainly is one of degree and not of kind. You see his distinction there. He's saying, yeah, certainly we know, of course, human beings are more intelligent. I mean, you might not be very comfortable, and I don't think we should be, with his language of the lowest man, ranking people in terms of their intelligence and their quality. But he is saying that human beings are greater than other species. But it's only a degree of a matter of degree, a difference of degree, not of kind. And in fact, he says it's certainly this. He was quite confident in that statement. Now, where do we go with that? Well, the title, as I said, for the talk, The Naked Ape, comes from this book by Desmond Morris, which has been reprinted in various editions, but it was first written in 1967. And he was a zoologist. And here's how Morris opened the book. He said, there are 193 living species of monkeys and apes. There's some of them on a chart. 192 of them are covered in hair. The exception is a naked ape, self-named Homo Sapiens. This unusual and highly successful species spends a great deal of time examining his higher motives and an equal amount of time studiously ignoring his fundamental ones. He is an intensely vocal, acutely exploratory, overcrowded ape, and it is high time we examined his basic behavior. This is frequently a cause of some embarrassment to him, but his old impulses have been with him for millions of years, his new ones only a few thousand at the most, and there's no hope of quickly shrugging off the accumulated genetic legacy of his whole evolutionary past. He would be far less worried and more fulfilled as an animal if only he would face up to this fact. So there's the claim. We're kind of worrying ourselves about nothing because we're denying our animal instinct. We like to think of ourselves as something higher, but actually we're just a naked ape. Now, Morris wasn't the first person to think that. As we say, it comes right out of Darwin, and he certainly wasn't the last person to think it. More recently, this term speciesism was developed by a guy called Richard Ryder, a philosopher, and he describes speciesism as being like racism or sexism. It's a prejudice that's based upon morally irrelevant physical differences, he said. So, if you look down on a chimpanzee, that's just like racism. It's like sexism. You're looking down on another creature because of a judgment that you're making that is not morally sustainable. The ethicist Peter Singer took up that idea of speciesism, and in 1993, he founded the Great Ape Project to work for the rights of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees await your protection, their website says. And Singer goes a bit further, actually. Darwin said the lowest human being is higher than the highest ape. But Singer actually says, apes are as intelligent as young infants, or maybe as human beings who have some intellectual impairment. And so they should be given the same rights as those people. And maybe those people shouldn't have the same rights as some of the others of us. But that's another question. So human beings are special in some way, but the argument that's here is actually that those differences are just of degree. There's nothing fundamentally different about human beings. So where do we go with that? Is there anything that is uniquely human? Well, we can think about that from a couple of perspectives. We could think about the physiological, the human body, and we could think of the sociological, human relationships and society. And if we look physiologically, the human body is different than the bodies of apes. We walk in an unusually upright way. Our stance is different. The pelvis is smaller. The brain is bigger. It's not the biggest brain on the planet. It's not even the biggest brain in proportion to body size, but it is unusually big, certainly compared to a gorilla or a chimpanzee and other apes. So yeah, there are some differences, but we can see a lot of similarities. You've probably been like me. You've been at the zoo, maybe with your children or grandchildren or just yourself, and you've looked at the chimps and you've sort of thought they really do look kind of human, don't they? And their faces look somehow human. So maybe the answer is not purely just looking at the big picture of the physical. What about if we look at the DNA, the genetics of human beings and apes? So on the Great Ape Project website, the argument that chimpanzees should be given rights, like human rights, they should be chimp rights, is based on the claim that human beings and chimps had a common ancestor 2 million years ago. So that's similar to what Desmond Morris was saying. We've had millions of years of evolution before we finally developed our higher qualities of social ability and so on. And then they say on the Great Ape website that the similarity between the DNA of a chimpanzee and a human being is very, very close. They say it's only a few percentage difference. Now, it's true at one level. 96% of the DNA sequence of a human being is similar or the same as the sequence of a chimpanzee. So there you go, 4% difference. That sounds like there's very little difference, doesn't it? But let's pause for a little moment, because that kind of comparison is misleading for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's misleading because we know that there's a big difference between a chimp and a human. You only need to look, don't you? I mean, you haven't gone to the zoo and confused one of the other human beings or a zookeeper for a chimpanzee. That just doesn't happen. You can see the difference. And when it comes to behavior, that difference is huge. We'll come on to that on the other side of the picture, on the sociological. But even at the physical level, even if the DNA is 96% similar, only about 20 or 30% of proteins are identical in a human being as they are in a chimp. So it sounds quite different if you say the similarity is only 20 to 30%. So there may be similar proteins between the two species, but there are important differences. But the bigger issue with this, with comparing the DNA, is that DNA doesn't tell us everything about a species at all. And it's not just me that says that. Geneticist and popular science author Steve Jones, who's not a Christian, not writing from that perspective, he's not trying to defend God in any sense, but here's what he says. He says a chimp may share 98% of its DNA with ourselves. I think that 98 is a little bit high, but let's not argue too much. But here's what he says. It is not 98% human. It is not human at all. It is a chimp. And does the fact that we have genes in common with a mouse or a banana say anything about human nature? Some claim that genes will tell us exactly what we really are. The idea is absurd. So that's Steve Jones' analysis. What about the sociological? Well, let me read you a little paragraph. I have an article under this title on my website, which is linked in the outline for this session, that has a longer version of this, but let me just read you a little snippet of it. Ask yourself as you listen, what species are we talking about, or what species could we be talking about as I read this? The male child was born after a long, painful labour. He was immediately wrapped up in material to keep him warm, and as soon as he had been washed, he was dressed in an outfit given by his grandparents. He was given a name by his parents, a label that would be used universally by other members of his species to attract his attention, gossip about him, and describe him. The day after his birth, the child was brought with great ceremony to a shelter around which his family would revolve for the next 18 years, or his life rather would revolve. 18 years or more living with his parents. The shelter was also inhabited by a member of another species, which was regarded both as a possession and to a large degree as part of the family. So what species is it? There's only one possible answer, because almost every detail in that little snippet is exclusively human. There's an awful lot at the sociological level, even with young human beings, with little children, that is distinctively human. Some of them are in that paragraph, the role of grandparents in caring for children, the long period of time that children live with their parents, the idea of having a home, not just making a shelter to keep the rain away from you, but actually having a home that you belong in, of having possessions, and certainly at the end, the idea of domesticating other species. We have a dog in our house, but you know, the dog is part of the family. My wife tells me that I shouldn't be so affectionate to her. My wife's from a different culture where dogs just don't come into the house in the same way. But I don't really think that the dog is one of my children. It's quite distinctive. It doesn't. We give it a name and it recognizes its name, but dogs don't give names to each other. Some animal species have distinctive cries to call out to another member of the group, perhaps amongst apes, chimpanzees, and so on. But they don't use those sounds to talk about those other individuals in their absence. They're not really names, in other words. And so sometimes, from time to time, you hear kind of things like elephants can draw pictures and chimpanzees can memorize things and can use tools. But when you dig a little bit deeper, you realize that they're really not the same thing as what human beings are able to do. Now, we could listen to the words of Ian Tattersall, who is a paleoanthropologist. In other words, he studies humankind based on the fossil record, and he's interested in what he believes to be the evolution of human beings. And in this book, Masters of the Planet, he says this: Homo sapiens is not simply an improved version of its ancestors. It's a new concept. When he's looking at all of these social differences, he says human beings, Homo sapiens, is a new concept. He's saying it's not what Darwin said, a difference of degree, but a difference of kind. And the reason behind that is something called this, Tom, theory of mind. Let me explain that. So theory of mind is defined as the ability to interpret one's own and other people's mental and emotional states, understanding that each person has unique motives, perspectives, etc. Here's how it works. First order intentionality, forgive the jargon, but theory of mind, first order intentionality means this, that I am aware of my own thoughts. Now, it's very difficult to get inside the mind of a dog or a dolphin or a pig or an elephant. But I think we could imagine, and we could say maybe those species in a chimp can have their own thoughts. But second order intentionality means that I understand that you have thoughts which might not be the same as my thoughts. That's what theory of mind refers to. And then third order means that I can understand that you have thoughts about what I might be thinking. So you're sitting watching me on a screen, and you might be thinking, what's really going through his mind? And that might include things like, when's the dinner going to be ready? Or when can I have a break and have it? Or, you know, why is he saying all of this? Is he just trying to impress us? Or is he actually trying to help us? Or what's he even talking about? So I can imagine what you might be thinking about what I might be thinking. And you can imagine what I might be imagining about what you might be imagining. We can do this, apparently, up to about 6 degrees back and forward before the brain fries and we can't cope with it anymore. Now, that is a distinctively human thing. It leads Derek Penn and his co-writers, who are cognitive psychologists, to say that there's no real evidence that any species other than Homo sapiens has anything, they say, remotely resembling a theory of mind. And in another article, which is on the screen, quoted, they say Darwin was mistaken. The profound biological continuity between human and non-human animals masks an equally profound discontinuity between human and non-human minds. Human beings are genuinely unique. And Jeremy Taylor, in this book, Not a Chimp, tells us this. He says, our relationship with the chimpanzee is in need of drastic revision. It has become dysfunctional thanks to a staple diet of popular science articles and television programs about chimps and other great apes, which take a simplistic view of the science available to us and use it to stress their extraordinary similarity to us in terms of both genetics and cognition, often with the active connivance of senior figures in the world of primatology, people who study primates, who should know better. The cuddlesome chimps are us image is misguided, wrong, and morally and intellectually bankrupt. And he concludes his book with this. He says, we are a truly exceptional primate with minds that are genuinely discontinuous to other animals. That's the kind of conclusion of our modern understanding of science, and particularly of the mind. So we're thinking now about some of the factors of human experience that I'm going to suggest to you are pointers beyond this life. And again, I realize that for people, many of these relate to theory of mind. And so not every human being has them. But most of the human beings that you're going to be doing apologetics with, who are able to reason and to follow reasoned arguments, will identify with these experiences. So we'll come back to the question of human value, even when people don't have those qualities. The first one is this: blushing. Blushing is a very human thing. Darwin actually recognized this. He called it the most peculiar and most human of all expressions. Mark Twain, a bit more witty, said, or he's quoted as saying, that man is the only animal that blushes or needs to. And it's true. Now, blushing is an odd thing. If you're thinking from evolutionary perspective, evolution, Darwinian evolution, is based on the idea that every advance, it has to have some advantage for us if it's going to carry on into subsequent generations. But when you get into some of these social behaviors, it's very difficult to understand what the advantage might be. Why is it an advantage to blush? How does that help you and help advance you? After all, you're trying to deceive other people. So why blush? It's the worst thing you can do. You give away your true emotions. You make yourself vulnerable to them. Another one is this: weeping. What we call psycho-emotional tears. Now, I mentioned that I have a dog, and sorry, I don't do this. I want to make that clear since this is being recorded. I don't poke my dog in the eye, but if I did, even accidentally, my dog would get tears in its eye. That's a physiological response. It's difficult to say what way other species experience emotions. Okay, so would they cry at pain? And that seems to be possible, that just the experience of pain in their body may cause tears to well up, some kind of physiological response. What is different about human beings is that we're the only species that cries at the suffering of another person. I'm not suffering, but I can see that you are. And that brings a tear to my eye when you listen to someone's story. Maybe when you watch the telethon from the charities on the TV and you see the suffering on the other side of the world. And you think, well, why am I caring so much? But you can't help yourself. So that experience of weeping at the pain of other people and the emotional pain of others is distinctively human. And the third one is fainting. I was doing a talk about this with students once, and they told me they'd heard about fainting goats. Always interesting what people raise. And there are goats that are called fainting goats, but they don't actually faint. If you look into it, you'll see it's not really fainting, because fainting is where you are emotionally overcome to such a degree that you lose consciousness. Okay? Now, again, think from an evolutionary point of view. Blushing doesn't make a lot of sense. How does it help you, give you an advantage? Crying at the suffering of others doesn't really do you much good. It might cause you to help them. And if they are related to you genetically, that might be an advantage to making sure your collective genes get passed on. But if they're on the other side of the world, it's no advantage at all. Or if they're a stranger on the road or from a different tribe, and yet we can have compassion with other people who aren't related to us. And not only that, compassion can overwhelm us so that we actually become incapable of helping. And when it comes to fainting, it's absolutely overwhelming. I mean, how is it any advantage to you that when you get scared of something, you faint? It's no advantage whatsoever. In fact, quite the opposite. You're making yourself vulnerable. The normal animal instinct is flight and fight, okay? Fight and flight. But the fright bit that can cause us to faint as human beings is distinctive to us. Now, I'm not claiming that any of these things prove that we are something other than just animals, but they are very interesting pointers in our experience to something beyond ourselves. They're pointers to our experience of shame and fear and compassion and our longing positively for security, for acceptance, and for innocence. We blush because we feel ashamed or guilty. We weep because we need to be loved and to love. We want security, so we get fearful when we're out of control or we're confronted with the possibility of death. And it seems like we are strangely ill at ease in the world that we inhabit. We're terrified by death. We're terrified by being found out in the things that we would rather keep hidden. We're overwhelmed with compassion at the suffering of others. We feel like it's unjust. The moral instinct kicks in as well, and it doesn't feel right. All of these things seem to point us to being ill at ease in the world that we live in. And I'm drawn to still, I think, one of the best statements of this concept. C.S. Lewis in 1952 in Mere Christianity said, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for these desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. Now, Lewis is making the argument from desire, another part of human experience. And he's talking about the desire for the transcendent and for God and the instinct to worship. I guess what I'm doing here is adding in with that these experiences of our emotional and social life that suggests that we don't really belong in this world. And if Lewis is saying maybe I belong for another world in the sense of the world to come, maybe these experiences of ours are echoes back to an earlier world, the world that we were really created for. So which story fits best? Here's the question with human experience. And this runs true even though some human beings may not have those experiences, may not have shame, and may not have fear in the same way. The picture, you probably can't see it. I should have made it a bit bigger. But it's another evolutionary picture. It has 4 sort of precursors to human beings, which are all saying or thinking, eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce, eat, survive, reproduce. And then you get to the last one, the man, and he's saying, what's it all about? Is this just a cruel trick of evolution? Somewhere along the way, our brains got oversized and complex, and then they developed theory of mind, which of course seems to have been a big advantage for us in terms of our domination of the world, but causes us so many problems at the same time in our mental health, in our relationships, in conflict, in our inner feeling of guilt. Are those things just byproducts of theory of mind that go along with the advantages that it has brought? Is that the best story to explain it? Now, again, I can't prove that that story is wrong. And I'm not talking, by the way, here about evolution versus creation and special creation. That's a whole other subject that would take at least an hour in itself. But whether creation, whether we came to be here through evolution or were created immediately as the human species, was God involved in this at all? Are these pointers beyond ourselves to the reality of God? And I'm going to suggest to you that the gospel story or the Bible story is a better fit for our human experience. It begins with creation. I like to think of that as God rules, as I'm explaining the gospel to people and connecting it with their questions. God rules. God created. There is purpose, there is design in these details of human life. And theory of mind is just one of our capacities that was given because of what I said earlier, God's capacity or God's intention that we would be stewards over creation in relationship to him. That's why God made us different, and that fits the evidence of what we discover. But the second part, Adam and Eve being expelled from the garden, we rebelled against God. This is perhaps the biggest enigma in human experience. How is it that we are so exceptional in our abilities, collectively, not necessarily individually, but collectively as a species, so capable of dominating the world, of manipulating it, of advancing it, of creating it, of thinking and so on, and yet we're also capable of such evil things that we blush at and should blush at? This is the enigma of human experience. And I think if you look at the other worldviews, the other stories that claim to explain human origins and human experience and human life, whether that's the naturalistic evolutionary approach, evolution just with no guiding intelligence, well, how does it explain that? Why is it that we're so ill at ease? I mean, it could explain why we do bad things, but it doesn't explain why we think they're bad, because there's no basis for that judgment in a naturalistic worldview. Other religions come up with answers, and that's another subject that maybe in a future forum we can talk about. But actually, they struggle to explain. They tend to either say that human beings are basically good, in which case they can't really explain the bad stuff. Why is it that people who have a good upbringing and a good education still can do such bad things? Or they say human beings are basically bad and we need the law kind of to control us. And that doesn't really explain the good parts of being human, the compassion that we're capable of. The gospel, the Bible story, because it tells us that we are not what we were created to be, does explain it. And that explains also why we as human beings are not what we could, or why some of us as human beings don't have some of those capacities. These are results of the fall. It doesn't make a person any less human, nor does it make them any less loved by God. So their body and their mind, not theirs, because this is all of us. Forgive me, I made it sound as if there are some people who are not what they could or should be. None of us are. All of us have our deficiencies, our weaknesses in our genes, in our minds, in our emotions, in our relationships. All of these things are directly or indirectly a result of sin, our rebellion against God. And the gospel, the Bible story of where we came from and where we're going to, explains that. But that is not the end of the gospel story. Thirdly, God rescues. And here we're thinking not just of Jesus, but of the whole story of God's promises to Abraham. In the Old Testament, his working through the nation of Israel, the law that he gave and the promises that he gave and the prophecies that he gave, and eventually the coming of Jesus into the world to fulfill all of that backstory and to bring salvation. God rescues. I'll say in closing a little bit more about that, about how this really tells us about the value of human beings. But if the first point tells us that God rules, and the value of every human being is that God created us for his purpose to know him. That's the root of human dignity. The next point, we rebel, tells us why it doesn't always look like that. But the third point, God rescues, tells us that every human life has value and dignity because God loved us enough to send his son to die for us and redeem us. Not only for the smart ones or the capable ones or the ones who have theory of mind or the ones who meet any other criterion, but for every single human being. And that's not based on our value, but on his love for us. But the gospel continues and says that we need to respond. The verse on the screen says, you might not be able to see it, the kingdom of God is at hand, repent and believe the good news, or the gospel. That's what Jesus said at the beginning of his ministry, according to Mark chapter 1. And so this need for us to respond, now that raises a question which I wish we could talk about. And I know some of you may be asking that, what about those who can't make a response verbally or intellectually, but the response part, of course, is based on the capacity that we do have. And so for those of us who are able to respond with the mind and with the will and with the understanding, that's the response that God calls for. To acknowledge that we have rebelled, that we are sinners, to acknowledge that we need God's salvation, to come back to recognize that God rules. God is God, and I'm not. And if we do that, or as we do that, God restores, the fifth point. And here is the fifth point of human dignity. And notice, I don't think human dignity rests on our rebellion or our response. The response is important in as far as we are able. For those who are not able, or whose response is less because maybe they can respond emotionally but not intellectually, or intellectually but not emotionally, and who of us is ever complete in both of those, then then that's between them and God, how he brings them into this salvation. But the fifth point is the last point on which our dignity hangs. We are created by God, first point, and loved by him for his purpose. We are loved by God so that he sent Jesus to die for us. That's the middle point. And the last point tells us we have eternal potential to live with God, to know him, and to be restored into the likeness of God. So the image of God is not lost in any human being, but it can be restored fully. I don't know what that's going to look like. The Bible tells us none of us know because we haven't seen Jesus yet. But when we do, we will be like him because we'll see him as he is. And that includes those of us, all of us, with our impairments and our limitation.